Control is not a simple thing. It requires vigilance, discipline, and sometimes intervention. For when the new creation becomes strong enough, independent enough, it can veer from its intended destiny to forge its own. For only when control is firmly and finally established can one rightfully hold the title of Master.
Hi, I'm Sam Parker, and I'm here today to tell you a little bit about Master of Orion 3, the just-released turn-based strategy game from Infogrames and Quicksilver Software. Master of Orion 3 has cut a relatively high profile for a turn-based strategy game. In good part, that's a result of the goodwill that the Master of Orion series has had over the years. The first game was released in 1994, shortly after Civilization, and the two games together sort of defined many of the conventions for the turn-based genre. In good part, these two games have similar mechanics in terms of asking players to research new technologies, expand and explore a 2D or 3D map in this case, and manage a number of different settlements, and eventually go on to a military conquest or some sort of larger end goal. So Master of Orion 3 has this behind it, but it is a significant departure from the previous games in a few different ways. The game's been in development since 2000 or a little bit before, and has had some significant changes over the course of the project. And one of the big things that is different from the previous games is the amount of automation in the game. The game has a tremendous scale. It's huge. It's massive. There's nothing to compare it to, really. You can play on the default map and be looking at 200 stars or more on what they actually call a huge map. And each of those stars has 2 or 7 planets that your empire or another empire can go ahead and colonize. So the only way they could make this game at all playable is through automating a number of tasks. So when you start the game, it's fairly simple. You go ahead and have a couple scout ships and a colony ship, and you start to expand your empire, guide the production of an initial planet, and as you go on in the early game, you can go ahead and micromanage the early planets, and it's a good idea to do so, so that you can stay on top of being most efficient in how you're building infrastructure, for example, mining or industry, research sorts of infrastructure, and in terms of building colony ships and some really simple military ships to guard your borders. But as things go along, there are a number of other elements that you might want to focus your attention on. So there is this automation AI that takes care of a lot of the finance and technological research and planetary management sort of tasks. One of the remarkable things about Master of Orion 3 is the fact that you can play it really quickly. With a game like Civilization 3, even, as great as it is, in the late game, things tend to bog down. At first, you only have a few units to move around, and the game, Civilization 3, for example, pushes you through turns. Here, you always have to push the turn button. You have to kind of force yourself to step back, say, well, I'm done, I need to push the turn button. But once you get into that mentality of making a few changes here and there, you can just really rush through turns pretty quickly. So I've sat down and played through 200 turn games in an afternoon. So really, this game is designed to be played quickly, which you'd think would work really well for multiplayer. So fundamentally, this is a 4X Space Empire game. It has all of the elements you'd expect: diplomacy, research, a real focus on expansion, colonization of new worlds, getting those worlds up to speed industrially, and military might, tactical battles, ground battles, espionage. There's a lot here. I mean, there are many different components. And one of the big problems with the game is fundamentally that the interface is just a maze. The game is daunting. It's not difficult to play, but it really doesn't lend itself to it doesn't give a whole lot of information to new players, or in fact, it gives new players too much information too quickly. There's no real tutorial, but there are just a series of text boxes called master notes that give you just a deluge of information on every new screen you get into. But once you kind of get things going, it's not a difficult game to play. For one reason for that is the AI is extraordinarily timid. It is not at all aggressive. That to say, you could start a game on the hard setting, just get rid of all your planetary defenses, hit the turn button 100 times, and not really worry about being invaded. The AI just really does not go after you in any significant way. But it still gives you a challenge if you are trying to expand quickly. The AI does expand. The AI does gobble up planets that you might want to colonize. So it's really more of a space race, a race to colonize as many planets as you can, to go ahead and put your military forces in choke points, because each of the stars are connected by a quick path between them. There isn't a whole lot of abstraction in Master of Orion 3. Abstraction can be very helpful in a strategy game to let players focus on the most important tasks, but there are some kind of odd abstractions in Master of Orion 3. For example, in organizing task forces of ships. Once you build a mobilization center at any planet, the production of any other planet in your empire, no matter where it's located in the galaxy, is available at that mobilization center the very next turn. So you could build 5 galactic battleships at the different ends of the galaxy, and the very next turn you could build a super task force with this, radically powerful ship. So there's a little bit of abstraction there, but really, given how complex this game is in general, I sort of welcome what few user-friendly abstractions the designers are willing to give me. Master of Orion 3's graphics are just downright unappealing. The 2D menus are fairly plain looking. The design just doesn't have much flash. It doesn't really live up to the expectations we have for a 2003 game, but the system requirements are extraordinarily low, so you could play this on any old laptop or any old PC out there. One of the places where the graphics look okay is with the diplomacy screen, but the diplomacy in Master of Orion 3 is relatively simplistic. You'll want to go ahead and form alliances with a few races, but at the same time, there isn't a whole lot of exchange you can really have with these races. The AI is pretty reluctant to do even sensible things like surrender when you're threatening its home planet. It will, for example, call a ceasefire, but it's not willing to give anything up. So why not just eradicate it? Pretty much the game ends up being focused on either eradicating all the other empires. There is a Senate presidency victory goal, which is pretty easy to win after maybe 200 turns, but it's also fairly easy to lose in a very frustrating way. If you leave the victory condition on and you don't start in the Orion Senate, you might just suddenly get the defeat screen simply because there was some other empire elected to the Senate, even though you weren't participating in the Senate at that time. The tactical combat is perhaps the worst looking part of the game, and it's also not a very interesting element of the game because you don't have very much control over your ships. There aren't too many tactical options, but one thing that is important is just to watch the combats and see how your ships are performing against the competition. The real important thing in shipbuilding isn't really to build efficient ships, because you can just hit the auto build button and it'll build perfectly efficient ships for you, but is to balance certain types of ships. There are long-range attack ships, indirect fire, that is missile ships, point defense ships, and carriers, and these sorts of things. There are actually a few more. So the important thing is to form task forces that balance the strengths and weaknesses of these different ships, and then go ahead and deploy them. And naturally, you want to pay attention to the strengths, technology strengths that your empire currently has versus the competition, and kind of keep track of the research. Otherwise, it's not very important to be involved in the research at all. You can just leave it to the automation. It's one of those nice little kind of hands-off player things, which had some charm in the earlier games, and here just along with the player building, there just isn't the same sort of personality to the game. Mass Orion 3 perhaps has most appeal as a multiplayer game, but certainly it's not a game that's going to be very quick to play, even though the turns go by fairly quickly and you can set time limits for the turns. At even a 2-minute time limit, you're talking about quite a bit of time even to hit the Senate victory goal. So this isn't something for casual players in multiplayer, and unfortunately the single-player game just isn't challenging enough. There's such a barrier to entry that you'd think that the game is very, very deep. But once you learn the game, it can be quite enjoyable for a certain amount of time, but then you just hit a wall where the AI isn't any more challenging. You can't set the difficulty to hard or impossible and expect it to do anything more. So at the end, Mass Orion 3 is just really brought down by a few flaws that prevent the game from even being as moderately good as it could have been.